and then I can edit it afterwards, and I'll start
Sure.
with audio too. Okay, great. So I've got a little blurb that I've put together from what you sent me earlier, and I can edit this because I usually do a separate section and then in that's more clear and put that in. But I'll just add that in. So
give me 1 second. I'm going to cut out this light behind me. It's a little too bright. Is that a little better?
Yeah.
There's still
Cool.
that. I'm trying to get that super bright light behind me to come off. There we go. That's a little better.
Good. Yeah. Just before we start, just one question. Did you have any chance to think about a cognitive dissonance type question? Two things which sort of contradict in your head. That's my kind of.
Yeah, I do my journaling on that.
Yeah. You can just. You don't have to do that at all. I'll just, as I'm introducing you, maybe something will come to mind. But that's just a little gimmicky thing that I have. Anyway, I've got some
like that. I'll think about it. I have a few in mind, but as we start talking, I'll consider some points.
Yeah, great. Okay, so I can edit this, and I usually do a clean intro and put it at the front. Right, so hi Nick, it's great to have you here this evening. Thanks for coming on my podcast. So this evening I've got with me Nicholas White, who is a genetic engineer at Ginkgo Bioworks and the founder of Flux Odyssey. At 18, he was diagnosed with ADD and cyclothymia, a form of bipolar disorder, and told he'd never be able to graduate college without taking medication like Ritalin and lithium. Despite dropping out of college twice while taking those fancy medications the psychiatrists were so fond of, he eventually graduated with a BS in chemistry and a minor in neuroscience without taking prescription stimulants. On the side, he co-founded the Fencing Club of Asheville, completed undergraduate research on the signaling protein GA13 and its role in cancer, and co-founded UNCA's first iGEM team to compete in a genetic engineering competition. Nick discovered how to solve his own health complications with supplements, nootropics, and natural products. He now works as a genetic engineer at a synthetic biology company on the cutting edge of science and has 4+ years experience as a molecular biologist. One of his current projects at work is helping with the strain engineering and process development of a COVID-19 RNA vaccine, a collaboration between Ginkgo Bioworks and Moderna Therapeutics. Nick can also be found on Twitter under @NicholasFWhite, and as mentioned earlier, he's also the founder of Flux Odyssey at flux-odyssey.com, a company which creates plant-derived cognitive supplements. Nick, I believe, has also started his own podcast recently, and it's great to have him with me this evening to explore the idea of IQ and imposter syndrome. There you go, Nick.
Thanks for the intro, James. Yeah, the podcast, Nick White is a podcast. The title's a bit of a placeholder for now, but I think people like it, and I'll look forward to having you on it one day in the future.
Yeah, that'll be good to be on there. So I've just got a few sort of random. We talked a little bit or discussed over the emails a little bit some ideas and threads. I can throw some in there. I don't know if you've got anything that's on your mind, sort of on that theme that we mentioned to start off with. All right, I can throw some things in there.
Yeah. So you sent me a very long email. That I really appreciated, and I replied to it. So we can sort of go a little bit off of what we talked about there.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'm happy to answer whatever questions you have, and yeah.
Yeah. So one of the reasons why I wanted to speak to you, Nick, is through Indie Thinkers, it had come up quite a lot in conversation that you sort of had this background in genetic engineering, and we were talking, in conversation on those channels about intelligence, etc. And something that's often struck me, especially with being a PhD student, is as you mentioned, this idea of IQ and imposter syndrome. Now, I've often reflected when I'm doing my PhD that I'm not fishing for compliments here. This is part of my shtick that I want to investigate through my podcast, etc. Is how come in the modern day someone like me who is of average intelligence, and again that's something that I'd like to put out there, because people usually try and say, "Oh, I'm so smart," but straight off the bat I'm saying I'm of average intelligence. How can someone like me do a PhD? Does this mean that there has been a debasement of sort of academia, or is it actually positive that someone who, might be of average intelligence, but who, to bring in that ocean personality type, someone who is quite open and enjoys reading and finding out about ideas, and who likes to write, and if you can spend a lot of time and it can actually write something half decent, does that mean that, in the modern world, that kind of higher education has been opened up to people like me, perhaps?
So I wanted to ask you this the other day. Have you actually taken an IQ test?
Yeah, I did a sort of free crappy one online.
Yeah, so the free crappy ones, I don't know how much I would trust those. I
Yeah.
think I've taken one of those as well. The real ones usually have to pay money for and actually sit down. Um, so I think one of the important things to remember about IQ is that there's a few points I want to make. One, in the field of psychology, it is one of the most predictive measurements. Now, predictive in this case usually means an R squared of about 0.3, which, in chemistry or physics, a good R squared value to claim something as predictive is about 0.9 or 0.95. That's basically, if you have a bunch of points on a graph and then you draw a line through it, how well does that linear regression predict data? For psychology, which is a very squishy science, as I like to call it, 0.3 is about as high as you'll get for anything. So, and IQ is basically a series of questions, puzzles, and what they do is they apply it to a large population, and then based on the scores, they'll center the normal distribution, that bell curve. They'll make the peak 100, which is average. And then everyone to the left, the standard deviation, I think, is about 15 points. So, and I think I heard at one point that if you make it to university, generally speaking, you're at least a standard deviation away from the norm. So about 115. If you finish a PhD, generally speaking, you're about 130. And then once you get higher than that, you find people in Mensa and doing crazy stuff. Now, the important thing to remember is that it's not necessarily measuring intelligence. It's measuring something called G, I believe, the G factor, which is essentially how fast you can do an IQ test. Now, it does correlate a bit with, if you look at the ocean model of personality, which, in comparison to Myers-Briggs or other personality types, I think the ocean model is the most statistically rigorous, which again is a very, very light R squared. But basically it's openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, introversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And openness is sort of like, it breaks down roughly into creativity and intelligence, but it's sort of like a willingness to experience new things, to tolerate, conflicting ideas in your head, for instance. like you're mentioning. So just by the fact that you're on Indie Thinkers and have a podcast and are talking to me, I would be willing to bet that you're probably quite high in openness.
Mm.
And I would encourage you to take one of those Ocean personality tests online. I think they're pretty good. But back to your original point about how do you think do we think the value of the PhD has gone down over time because we're letting more people in? I do, but I'm not going to connect it to what you perceive as your level of intelligence. I too, because I work in a field where intelligence is highly valued. You know, I grew up my entire life people telling me, "Oh, you know, Nick, you're such a smart kid, and you know, if you just applied yourself more, you could go so much further," which is a common refrain for people with ADD. I think intelligence. Well, let's focus on IQ tests. It's extremely predictive for people who score less than 100. So for instance, the military did a lot of IQ testing back in the day, and they found that people who scored less than 70, which we used to call, you know, slow, or before it went out of style, you know, they used to call it mental retardation. They found that you could try to train those people to do simple tasks, but that no matter how hard you train them, if they scored below 70, it was much more common for them to screw up simple tasks, much less complex, you know, like tactical execution for, like, I don't know, special forces or something. So it's quite predictive below 100. Above 100, it becomes not predictive almost at all. And I don't know if you follow Nassim Taleb on Twitter.
With him, yeah.
Very sharp math guy, made a lot of money in the stock market. Now he's a pretty brusque personality, but I don't hold that against his the comments he makes on fields like psychology that rely heavily on statistics. His main point is that people don't understand stats well enough, and they make extremely wild claims based on pretty crappy data. And I would tend to agree with that. I think that, you know, unfortunately for people publishing papers, there's an incentive to demonstrate that something is, you know, positive, something is real. We didn't, you know, it's not like we did an experiment and failed, because we wouldn't publish those results. We only publish the things that are positive. And that's why you see all these psych papers, you know, that get kicked around and end up in the public consciousness. And then 15 years later, they try retesting it and they can't replicate it. So this is becoming a little bit long-winded, but I think PhDs, the value of have maybe gone down slightly, but because universities are essentially a pyramid scheme now, where the amount of professors' positions are limited. It's linear, but they keep getting more and more students. And this is really true in the life sciences. They get a ton of PhD students who they can get to do a lot of work extremely cheaply. The PI basically just writes grants all day. And the promise is that after the PhD, you know, after a couple postdocs, they might be able to become professors. But I graduated from a very small state liberal arts school in North Carolina, which is not very well known for its science. The chemistry department is quite strong, but all of the professors there in the chemistry department and in the biology department, they had PhDs from Stanford or you know, very, very high level Ivy schools. And so if you imagine them as being, you know, cream of the crop, but only able to get into a small state school, that means you're, you know, if you decide that you want to get into academia, you're competing for those people for the same positions. And I saw a lot of people in my chemistry class when they graduated, you know, I would say something crazy like 65% of them, like, you know, maybe 50, 60 kids, they all went to go get PhDs. And I don't want to be mean, but for a lot of them, you know, I would ask them, I was like, why are you getting a PhD? Because you didn't seem like you were even excited about the science in undergrad.
Mm.
And they said, well, you know, because I want to get a job. I'm like, have you looked on the internet and like browsed forums about people who have PhDs? A lot of times it's a brutal process. You can definitely get weeded out. You know, it's definitely likely that it's gonna affect your mental health at some point. You could get stuck with a crappy advisor or project. I have a friend whose fiance is trying to apply for a job here in the States, and her PI won't let her get her PhD. She did like 4 years on a project, and then he said, this isn't, you know, we're stopping this project. I need you to do a new one. And she's like, okay, yeah, I'll work on another one for 2 years. He's like, no, I need you to start over. And no one can touch him because he has tenure, and he's, you know, even though he's, you know, taking advantage of the situation. So remind me again what you're getting your PhD in. It's political
It's
or?
on the relationship between the US and the UK over ballistic missile defense.
Okay. And that's what your thesis is on?
Yeah. It's the mix of international relations and domestic politics in the UK, and how that translates into this policy of cooperating with the UK and US over ballistic missile defense.
Would you have studied that if you couldn't get a PhD?
It's something that I did at master's level, but I think what I found in recent years is I've really enjoyed doing my PhD. And yes, I did want to be, or do want to be, a university lecturer, but over the past few years, I've thought about the bureaucracy, etc.,
Right.
and how much work is involved, and I've thought more along the lines that, well, I'm a in US terms, I'm like a high school teacher. So I could get my PhD, which is something that I wanted to do, but I could then do blogging and vlogging, etc., on the side, and just explore ideas as I wish without any of the massive workload,
Right.
and that might just be fine for me.
So you weren't planning. It sounds like to me you wanted to get a PhD to educate yourself more.
I did, yes, I did.
It wasn't necessarily for the credentials or to go into academia.
Not necessarily, but then again, this links back with the subject of what we're talking about, and me feeling this kind of inadequacy around being smart or trying to look smart. Not that I think that is something that people should be. It's something that's an insecurity of my own, let's say.
Right, and it's very common. It sounds to me like, you know, as much as I can comment on this, the people who want, like, I have a friend of mine who's going for his PhD in biophysics, and he and two other people, maybe three other people, were the ones in the chemistry and biology department that I thought should go get PhDs because they were motivated outside of their GPA. They didn't place expectations or assumptions at the end of it. They just really loved science and they wanted to go further. And the best way to do that was at a PhD level, because they would get access to really cool labs and more importantly, advisors. Now, when I graduated, I was already fed up with the bureaucracy and the I don't know. I find that a lot of my degree was basically useless. Like a lot of the required classes, you know, they make you take something in like humanities or writing, and the humanities was basically, they compressed all of world history in the 4 classes. They tried to teach philosophy, art, science, but it ended up basically being these adjunct professors that would try to pitch their personal worldviews, which Asheville was a very liberal. I would compare it to like maybe like a city in California. I grew up in Durham, North Carolina, and then in Rochester, New York. And I always considered myself fairly liberal. And then I moved to Asheville, and I was like, oh wow, I'm like nowhere near near the edge. So I, ended up getting into some into verbal discussions and arguments, which I like doing if people can remain polite. But I decided I only applied to one PhD program, one master's program, got into one, but I applied to Ginkgo because I loved lab work. I loved working in the lab with my hands. It's a lot like cooking. I used to work in a kitchen before I went back to school. I think the worst I had imposter syndrome or was self-critical about my intelligence was the first time I dropped out of college was for pretty serious mental health reasons. I was just not in a good place, and it was costing like $56,000 a semester, or no, $56,000 a year, which is crazy. And I was like, I don't want to just end up with a random degree I don't care about. This is basically an expensive summer camp for kids. The second time I went back to the same college, that's when I actually failed classes, especially my chemistry class. I hated chemistry. If you had told me years ago I would have majored in chemistry, I would have laughed at you, because general chemistry is the most boring, unapplicable. It wasn't until I took organic chemistry that I decided that I really loved the subject. But after the second time, I was like, I might be too dumb or too crazy to get a degree. I had doctors tell me, like, you'll never graduate if you don't take some sort of stimulants and maybe like some sort of mood, like antidepressant. You're not gonna be able to do it. So when I went back the third time, majored in chemistry, ended up with a decent GPA, and did it all without prescriptions, or for the most part without prescriptions. That was a moment where I was very proud. I knew that I could handle it, but I was more proud, not about the classes, but about the research I did. I felt really powerfully about the things I was able to accomplish in lab. And if you look at the sum total of science, it's very modest. It's not like the old days where you could advance biology, chemistry, physics, and philosophy with one person, because we just know too much now. So the best part about science is that you don't need to be a super genius. You just need to understand how science works, dedicate a lot of hours, and build up a tolerance to failure. I would say that's the most important thing, is some emotional resilience, because you are going to fail a lot. And if you do that and collect good data, there's a comic somewhere online where they talk about, the sum total of human knowledge is this massive circle, and you can only contribute to a tiny little bubble, and you push forward into the darkness. And that, to me, even if the scale in comparison to everything we know now is small, the fact that I was able to contribute just a little bit, that means something to me. So I thought industry was the right way to go, because I wanted to make some money. And I thought the learning experience would be a lot more hands-on. And it has been. There is some bureaucracy, but definitely not as bad as academia. And I think after 6, maybe 10 years, it might be a little bit longer before I feel like I'm PhD equivalent. But I also have time to learn other things, like starting Flux Odyssey, because I wanted to learn more about business and supplements. So where I think the PhDs have become the most inflated and overvalued is, unfortunately, a lot of the social sciences. I think a lot of them have become sort of taken over by ideology. They're not interested in actually learning anything. They're more interested in cranking out sort of like activists because they want to change the world. And that's really a shame, because I think that there's a lot that the humanities can offer the world. But there's some figure about how 90% of papers published in certain fields, especially any field that has the word studies attached to the end of it, they don't get recited. They're never cited again, probably never read again. People are spending tons and tons of hours on this research. I use that term lightly in this case, that is really not that important and not that rigorous. And if they put those hours into research that could be more useful. Now the problem is that a lot of it is the way grants are given, and they have to be applied. So it's much less likely for someone who has a crazy moonshot idea that if it worked would change the entire field. That person is a lot less likely to get funding than someone who's basically doing the exact same work as someone else, but changing it by like a hair.
Yeah.
And that's really a pity. There's been talk about trying to go back to the old ways of doing science and art, where when we had a nobility class, they would basically sponsor favorite artists or scientists to do their work.
Yeah.
I think there's been some talk about how grant writing and peer review have been sort of corrupted to the point where it acts as, this is Eric Weinstein talking about this, as sort of a filtering mechanism for ideas that are socially acceptable or science that's socially acceptable. And tying this back to IQ, IQ is one of those sciences that people people either take it way too seriously and I try to apply it to everything, or abuse it for their own political gain, which I think is quite disgusting, or they throw it out entirely. And unfortunately, you can't do either. You do have to pay attention to at least some of I would say the strongest claims that IQ makes. But it has a bad history, and unfortunately it's only an okay measure, which is an issue. If it was a great measure, that would be another thing. But I would say maybe the most important takeaway from IQ is that there might be certain people who basically are unable to do certain levels of jobs. There might be people for whom there's no job available that they can complete. And how do we as a society take care of those people?
Yeah.
I think we have an obligation. The right thinks that there is no person for whom there isn't a job. And the left would say there's no person for whom training would get them to the point that they can do a job. And they're both wrong in different ways.
No, I think that's a really good overview of the history of IQ and some of the strengths and the shortcomings of it. What I'd like to move on to a little bit now is some of those perhaps thoughts that we can explore around how to maybe reassure ourselves is too a stronger word, but how maybe coping mechanisms is too strong a word as well, but things which I know you mentioned, and I've got a few as well. You mentioned about certain mindsets which can be helpful or unhelpful. So, for example, thinking that it's either Einstein or nothing.
Yeah. So I used to be very prideful about my intelligence. I always liked to feel like I was the smartest person in the room as a kid. But there's a saying, if you're the smartest person in the room, you need to go to a different room. Now, you shouldn't be the dumbest person in the room, because that's sort of a tough place to be too. But you should be surrounded by people that, some who are smarter and maybe some who are not as smart. But you surround yourself with people that are going to help push you forward. And it's okay to be competitive about whatever it is. You can be competitive about grades or research or whatnot. Intelligence, I think, unfortunately, quickly becomes a dick measuring contest. that I find sort of repugnant. I mean, yeah, sometimes I wish I was a lot smarter. You know, that friend of mine, John, who's getting his biophysics PhD, you know, sometimes I look at how competent he is with like certain level of math. And I'm like, man, I wish I was a better mathematician, you know. And I could be if I put in the work that he did, but I don't find math as interesting as, say, genetic engineering. And so, you know, if you consider that maybe everyone has a value system that, like, the top 5 values are basically what drive their entire character. I don't think intelligence should be number 1. Intelligence is value.
Yeah.
It's an attribute. It matters how you apply it. So the Einstein or nothing fallacy, I would say, can lead to the imposter syndrome, where you want to be brilliant, right? I read that book about Richard Feynman, you know, bless you, Mr. Feynman. So it's an amazing book. He's an amazing person. But if you read the biographies of people that are at that level, and then you try to compare yourself to them, that's insane. That's like comparing yourself to the top 0.00001% of humans, not even in your generation, but in existence, and then getting sad that you don't feel like you rank as highly on one attribute. When, you know, you could talk about you know, charisma or strength or wisdom. God, I'm going off of like D&D character traits, but like there's other things you can compare yourself to. I think it's more important what you apply the intelligence to. And just defeat that self-critical voice you have in your head. Bill Burr is one of my favorite comedians, has a great clip where he talks about, you know, being depressed or unmotivated to do work. And he said the thing that saved him was just saying, fuck it. Like, I'm not going to pay attention to that. I'm just going to do the work. I don't care how bad it is. I like applying anything that's worth doing is worth doing poorly. Just sort of the flip of anything that's worth doing is worth doing well. Because perfectionism can set in and then you'll be paralyzed and you can't do anything. So I'd much rather do something quickly, poorly, have it be in existence, and then endlessly modify and evolve it. You know, one of the most useful principles from biology is natural selection and evolution. If you look at these amazing enzymes that are perfectly tuned to do a specific reaction, they didn't start that way. Often the enzymes, the genes were duplicated, and one of them had a very slight partial ability to do a particular reaction that wasn't what it originally evolved for. And then over time, you know, it's selected for mutations until after several generations, it becomes, you know, one of the most amazing nanotechnologies that you can see. I like to apply that to myself. I'm very bad at a lot of things, but sucking at a thing is the first step to being kind of okay at it. So, just do directed evolution on yourself.
I mean, that's entirely true. Again, with this, I'm not saying that IQ is something that should be held as some kind of personality trait that's desirable. In fact, I feel it's kind of like it's a weakness that I've kind of got this insecurity about it. It's almost like a form of dysphoria. Let's say, you know how people have body dysphoria. Well, I think maybe people can suffer from, let's say, intellectual dysphoria. But this is the thing, you know, I'm coming on and saying, hey, I'm an average guy. You know, I'm not trying to say that I'm smart, because I'm not, but that's what I'm fascinated with exploring. how far people can get through hard work, like you're saying, etc. And just having an interest in something and chipping away at it, that's where people can make a lot of progress. I mean, one thing that I like to think about is this idea that I've got about asymmetric intellectualism, which is whereby if someone's of average intelligence, that means that, you know, they see the world as average as, you know, the regular people do. So if you're able to articulate that in a way that people can understand, that is going to be intelligible to a broad mass of the population. So that's an advantage, whereby someone who's super smart might not be able to communicate in a way that is readily understandable to a lot of people.
Yeah, you sacrifice something for sure with super high intelligence. This sort of ties into an evolutionary theory called the cognitive trade-off. Basically, the reason why we're born and as babies, humans are basically incapable of taking care of themselves is because our brains are so large that to get it through the birth canal without breaking hips and keeping the hips skinny enough that there's a hypothesis that we were primarily long distance runners back in the day. Not very good on short sprints, but because we could sweat and we're hairless, we could basically chase down herds of animals. And over a couple of days, I mean, this is like running an ultra marathon. The animals would basically just like suffer heat stroke, and we'd come up and just, you know, bang them with a club, and that's how we hunted. But there's a pressure between, you know, the safety of the mother, the head size of the kid. So we're basically born as really, really, really incomplete juvenile humans. And it takes, you know, something like 18 or 24 years to be fully mature. How was I tying this back into? Oh yeah, so I would much rather be of somewhat, you know, slightly higher than average intelligence, but then be a genius in hard work, or even more importantly, pick the right thing to work on. Unfortunately, there's a lot of super geniuses who are working in the financial industry. They get their PhD in physics from MIT, they look at what's available, and you know, before SpaceX, maybe they weren't too keen on going to work for Lockheed Martin and designing chips that are going to go into a missile to blow someone up.
Yeah.
And they maybe didn't want to keep studying string theory because they knew it was a dead end. So they said, I'm going to go into finance and just make $1 zillion. And I really think that, like, the financial industry, they don't make anything. They really, anyways, I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, but yeah, I really wish we could. I really like what SpaceX is doing. I think we need more companies like that, or more government pushes to do the impossible, to shoot for, you know, trying to make a colony on Mars or studying human longevity. I am interested in figuring how we can maybe increase intelligence, but I would want to start it on the people that are the most vulnerable in our society.
You okay? Hi, back.
I don't know when we lost connection, but hopefully the recording is still going.
Yeah, the recording is still going. Good. I don't know what happened there.
Very strange.
Okay. I'm just trying to think where we were.
What was the last thing I said to you that you remember?
You were talking about genetic engineering for IQ and longevity.
Right. So I am interested in how genetic engineering and nootropics and other technologies, especially the ones like this, which are increasingly going to become a part of us, not just a separate object. I think we're going to start becoming integrated with machines, especially if you look at, like that company Neuralink with Elon Musk. But I am interested in increasing IQ. I think that obviously it should first be applied to the most disadvantaged populations, because as society becomes more technically complicated, we quickly become bifurcated into people who can use technology and keep up with all the craziness, and those that can't. And if you can't, there might come a day, quickly, where there's just not a job that you can do if you can't. I mean, we're automating and putting AI, to use that term loosely, into everything. And manual labor jobs are still needed, but a lot of entry-level white-collar jobs are becoming automated away. So I think more important than increasing IQ is if we could find a way, and I don't know if science is going to have the answer to this, but the problem is that we're becoming more technologically capable, but we're not becoming any more wise, which is really scary. Because, imagine that everyone in the world gets a button. If you press the button, you end the world. How long do you think we would last? I mean, statistically, almost 8 billion people on the planet. Someone is crazy enough to push it. And we're not quite there yet, but, the atomic bomb is a big wake-up call. As a genetic engineer, I am nervous about the potential misapplications of the technology. Right now, it's complicated enough, and our power is still limited to the point where I don't think any malicious bad actors in their garage could really do anything seriously harming. It's sort of locked up into companies and governments. But if it becomes more open access without oversight, that makes me a little nervous. And what is it? What are we here for? What is it all for? That's a good question.
Well, that just reminds me of sort of these rumors you hear about Chinese CRISPR babies.
We already have them. There was a guy who came out. He was universally derided by the scientific community, with the exception of a few people like George Church, who didn't really defend him. But so it was 2 in vitro fertilizations. One of the parents had HIV. And there was a modification to a receptor that would prevent them from ever contracting HIV. But it was very strange because the parent that had HIV, it wasn't going to be able to infect the kids. I think it was the dad and some of the science about that. And HIV is not very prevalent in China. So it was a very strange edit to make. And one of the embryos got the edit in both copies of the chromosome. The other kid was heterozygous, meaning the edit only got in one, not the other. They went forward with both, and the kids are already born. This scientist came out basically because he wanted to be acknowledged. He got disappeared for a while because China was not happy with him. But someone else pointed out that this is an edit that they were studying in another university as it applied to increases in intelligence. Now, for my part, looking at it amorally, not immorally, just like without any ethical judgment. One, I knew China was going to be doing the first CRISPR baby edits for sure, because they just have a different moral and ethical system than we do. So I wasn't surprised that they were going to be the first. I do think that this opens the potential for the US and Europe to start doing gene edits in embryos, but they're going to have to pick edits that are of a more rigorous ethical standard. Like, I would pick an edit. There's a lot of really horrible muscular dystrophies. My mom's a neurologist. She studies like Lou Gehrig's disease and spinal muscular atrophy. If you do a screening ahead of time, or your kid is born and you find out that it has one of these horrible diseases, which is basically a one base pair mutation, where it's only in one gene, that would be a much more ethical genome edit. As long as you're not touching the germ line, the edit is not going to be passed on, although we could get into that discussion. One of the most amazing things is, for my mom's entire career, I would ask her, how's work going? And she said, well, we know a lot, but basically I diagnose people and then I have to watch them slowly die because there's no medications. Now, within the past 5 years, there's been a few medications that came out. One is called morpholino drugs, which look like DNA, but the backbone is modified so it can't get degraded in the body. And they picked out a sequence that would bind to the RNA of a particular, it was a muscular dystrophy, and basically it was a break in the gene that connects like muscle cells to like skin, I think. And if it's it's the biggest gene in the human genome, so it's very easy to break. You just have one mutation and you do a frame shift, and now the whole thing is garbage. So it's called Duchenne muscular dystrophy. They figured out that if the morpholino, that DNA sequence bound to the mRNA, you could get something called exon skipping. The ribosome would process it different, and you could get a truncated but functional version of the protein and basically convert Duchenne muscular dystrophy, where people die like when they're 20 because they can't like breathe, to Becker's muscular dystrophy, which is a much milder form. But it didn't work very well in clinical trials. When the FDA passed it, one of the top guys resigned because he was sort of disgusted by how quickly they passed this thing without very good data. A much better medication is one of the first gene therapies that's been licensed, and it's for spinal muscular atrophy. So similar story. I mean, these are basically kids that die before the age of 5 because they have a broken copy of this gene. It's like a one base pair mutation. So what they did is they loaded what's called a plasmid, which is a circular loop of DNA, sort of like it's like the main unit by which we do molecular biology work. You can sort of pass these plasmids in and out of bacteria and put antibiotic markers of resistance on there so you can do selection and whatnot. They put a functional copy of the protein on this plasmid and then loaded it into an AAV, which is a type of virus that infects humans. But the virus, they took out all the nasty bits. It's basically just a DNA plunger. And so they inject the AAV with the plasmid into the child's cerebrospinal fluid. The AAV pushes in the plasmid into all of the cells that it needs to. And then these kids who basically had a death sentence are suddenly, they're sitting up, they're smiling, they're crying, they have normal facial. I mean, they look, I was talking to my mom, they basically seem like normal children, which is amazing. Now, they didn't CRISPR in that edit.
Yeah.
Those kids still have the non-functional version of the gene. They just gave them a functional copy that they can use to produce the protein and be okay. Now, this disease affects so few people in the world that it got a orphan drug status, which means it got rushed to the FDA. But it looks like it works, but they want like $1.5 million for the treatment. So now there's a whole thing between the pharmaceutical company, the insurance, and the government, and patient advocacy have to come together and figure out how this is all going to work. But it's very exciting because for the first time in my mom's or another neurologist's career, there's a treatment for these horrible diseases. So I understand that people have a lot of fear about genetic engineering. I think the fault for most of that is because Monsanto was extremely shady in their practices with making this like, crazy corn that was Roundup ready and had all this like intellectual property around it. And then they were suing other farmers if like the seeds would blow on there. It's pretty disturbing to me, but I think people are going to feel differently about genetic engineering when it's being used to save children from diseases that are just brutally horrible. And I think we'll get there in our lifetime. I think cancer is going to become a thing of the past in our lifetime. I make this joke that at some point in our lifetime, we'll cure 3 cancers in a day, and it'll be like page 9 news. It'll be routine.
Yeah.
But this is the optimistic view. This is the view that maybe we might be getting into a golden age of human achievement. But there's a lot of stuff going on right now that looks like it might slow and hinder. I mean, we're in the middle of a coronavirus pandemic.
Yeah.
Pharmaceutical companies obviously they don't want to sell cures. They want to sell treatments that you have to take for your entire life, because a one-time cure, they can't make too much money off of that. There's a lot of things to be skeptical about, black-pilled about even. If you look at the world in a certain way, it's very depressing to see how much money runs things, which is why, to go back to my main point about, even though I am interested in increasing longevity and intelligence, I think right now, one of the things that we're lacking in the most is wisdom and compassion.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's something you can engineer into people. I think that's something you have to learn. And I don't know what the right answer is for that.
No, but just your comment there about how wisdom and compassion, kindness are the most important traits. I mean, I don't know, I'm being a bit lighthearted right now, but have you ever heard of a guy called Rick Rosner?
No, I haven't.
Rick Rosner, he was, or he is, or he isn't at the same time, the smartest guy in the world. But he calls himself the dumbass genius. So apparently he's got an IQ of 200, right?
Wow.
Yeah, and he's very tongue-in-cheek about it. He's got this fascinating story. So, he's a super smart guy, but you'd think with an IQ like that, you might try and, cure cancers or make all the world's nuclear weapons inoperable. What he did with that was he spent sort of his late teens, early 20s, living the fantasy of trying to come back to school, to his high school, so that he would be the older, cooler kid who will then know how to act. And what he did was he used to fake all his IDs. And I think he went back to school for about 3 or 4 years after he graduated, pretending to be younger than he was, so he could be cool. And then what he spent a lot of his time doing is feuding with another guy who's supposedly the smartest guy in the world on game shows like Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, trying to win them. So this is the point that I'm trying. They've got this obsession with intelligence, with this IQ score, and he takes the mick out of himself in that way. I think he's a comedy writer now, but that's
So
where it can go down.
People are motivated by more than just a benevolence to the human race. That's pretty low on our list of things that motivate us. We're motivated by sex. We're motivated by our ego. We're motivated by how other people judge us. There's a great blog called Wait But Why that has a post about ignoring the woolly mammoth in all of us or something like that, which is basically that humans evolved from extremely tribal origins where social reputation was extremely important, much more important than intelligence, which is why people feel very uncomfortable voicing opinions that are not acceptable by the other group. We care much more about our reputation than we do about being right, which is why, you can do psychological studies where you put like 10 people in a room and 9 of them are plants by the study. And they say, what color is this object? And it's clearly purple. And, 9 of them will go green. And the 10th person, who's the experimental subject, will also say green because they don't want to be the one guy who looks crazy. And then the post went into like basically how difficult it is, but how important it is to ignore your reputation, not your reputation, but it's more important to be honest with yourself than it is to be perceived well. Unfortunately, the internet has made it super easy to severely damage people's reputations in these like pseudo-anonymous mobs online, and there's no retribution. It's not illegal.
Yeah.
Twitter mob someone and accuse them of horrible things, and for the people affected, it's a horrible experience to go to. I mean, you can lose your job, which is bad, but I don't know, losing your word, I think, or losing your reputation it takes a lifetime to build a reputation, and you can lose it in a day. Depending on what, I'm not saying some people don't deserve to keep their reputation, obviously. The Harvey Weinstein did not, deserve to keep his reputation. But fortunately, a lot of victims are just average Joes who didn't do anything. So
another point I was just going to come back there with Rick Rosner, the other guy whose name I forget, is, again, I believe when they went to college, they both independently tried to come up with a theory of everything. But I can't remember what it was. And the reason why I'm mentioning that was because I think maybe this comes back to this idea of them being too smart for their own good. In these documentaries, they articulate what the theory was, but it was so vague and all-encompassing that I can't remember what it was. And that's the criticism. Usually when you've got some good theory, it's sort of parsing things out. But theirs was so general. Sorry?
It has to be falsifiable.
Yeah. So
that's the problem with string theory. Eric Weinstein did a very good podcast where he talks about, he also has this theory about the direction that physics should go, even though he's a mathematician. It's an interesting idea, as far as I know, from a layperson's perspective. The idea has been you need to combine quantum physics with basically Newtonian physics, with gravity, with Einsteinian theory of relativity, and then all the particle bits. And they try to do it with string theory, but you can't really test it. It seems to predict everything. And he went back further to the original theories and found that they rely on different theories of geometry. And he was like, your base language is different. Why don't you try to have a common geometry for both of these and then rederive them and then try to combine them like that? Which, interesting thought. I don't know. He hasn't really talked too much about the specifics on it yet, so he hasn't really opened himself up to criticism. But I am curious to see. I'm always curious to see when anyone comes up with a different a different, physics theory or about anything really in science. I think people should be free to sort of, doesn't necessarily have to pass through the critical filter of scientific journals. There's a lot of scientific journals that are basically paper mills where everyone cites each other and you have to pay them $5,000 to get published. They basically are just scam to get money and publish crap. A lot of journals, they look at the research, they falsify data. There's a great Twitter user I follow whose name is Elizabeth Bick, who decided to take a year off to basically look through papers and find all of she started off with figures where the photos, they have like duplicated images. And she was like, you're falsifying your images. But then she found that it was so widespread. She was like, oh my God, I got to take time off to see how far this goes. And it's really quite depressing to see how much of science is not replicable, over exaggerated claims, relying on bad assumptions or outright, counterfeit.
Yeah, I know there's it just undermines people's faith in things when things get so bad. I was just another thought that I was going to come back to, maybe as we come towards the end, is this is something that I heard Jordan Peterson saying about living in a non-resentful way towards people that are really smart, and that's because they can make things and do things that average people can't do. It's not a zero-sum game. If someone is smart enough to design a computer or an iMac or do help cure diseases, that's something that we all benefit from. It's not a zero-sum game. It's something to be celebrated.
Right, exactly. That's probably the biggest benefit of capitalism is all this technology we're using right now exists because there's great rewards if you can make something that a lot of people value highly. Obviously, the problem with capitalism is when it breaks. And, I look at the bailout that they just passed in the US where $2 trillion, no oversight about how that money is spent. And everyone's, excited to get their $1,200 check in the mail, which for me went right to my rent. So, I would say don't be resentful of intelligent people. It's not like they stole their intelligence from anyone. Hope that they're motivated by the right things. And instead of wasting time on a game show, maybe they apply themselves to something a little more valuable to society. And I think everyone has intrinsic value.
Yes,
all men have intrinsic, I think that's saying all men are created equal. I think it's all men are created equal in the sense that they have value outside of being an employee, we'll say.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's so important to remember. It's people's character that's important. So, we've gone over an hour now. Nick, I don't know if you want to feel comfortable drawing this to a close shortly.
Yeah, sure.
I didn't know whether you had any comments about anything else you'd like to add, or whether you'd had any thoughts about sort of the primitive accumulation question about cognitive dissonance. Are there any?
So I did want to ask you about where the term primitive accumulation came from, like how you named the podcast, and I think I might have a point on the cognitive dissonance question. I'd like to hear your answer first.
Yeah, so the idea of primitive accumulation, it's actually a theme from Karl Marx. It's one of his theories of how capitalism starts up. So basically what he says is that, where does the original money come from? Or the original wealth come from? It comes from primitive accumulation. What is primitive accumulation? It's either war or plunder or imperialism. So the king, gets his money from the peasants that he robs, etc. And then over history, that eventually turns into capitalism. Now, the reason why I took it up, rather a brutal kind of phrase, but I used it as the title for my podcast because I'm just trying to primitively accumulate little steps. I don't mean through violence. I mean, I'm just doing a little podcast here, a little blog here, a little vlog, and just primitively accumulate content, let's say.
I really like that. I really like that a lot. I'm trying to do the same thing. I had a really good discussion with Justin Murphy the other day because I was getting stuck in my own head about perfectionism and like, you know, maybe I'm not really that interesting in my points. You know, no one's gonna want to listen to what I have to say. And he gave me some good feedback. And basically, it was like, for me, and this goes back to your other point about what to do about when you feel imposter syndrome. There's a great video on YouTube called, it's by this guy, Modern Martial Artist. So he analyzes a lot of UFC and boxers. And he has one about alter egos, which I think is brilliant. And he analyzed, you know, the four kings of boxing, you know, Hagler and Roberto Duran and God, I'm not going to name all of them right now, but 3 out of the 4 had alter egos that they would use in the ring. You know, Mike Tyson had one, Iron Mike, where basically Mike Tyson, the person, was allowed to feel nervous and anxious about the fight. But his coach actually used hypnotism on him and other things. And he created an alter ego when Diamata, his coach, said, you know, I wish you were bigger. And he said, I'm going to turn this character, Iron Mike, I'm going to draw from all of the villains and movies and stories and just be this brutal fighter in the ring and let him handle all of the boxing. And then Mike Tyson will handle all the stuff in your real life. So, you know, for me, I try to separate out the writer or the creative entity, which is very sensitive to criticism and self-doubt, away from my editor and my publisher.
Yeah.
The creative person, no judgment on whatever comes out. The goal is to just produce as much as possible, you know.
Yeah.
Creative muses love a working stiff more than someone who works off of inspiration. Excuse me. So as far as an alter ego, I think Nick White, the person, or James Simpkins, the person, is allowed to feel imposter syndrome and doubt and maybe even shame about intelligence for not being smarter. But you know, Nick White, the scientist, isn't allowed to feel that. That's an alter ego I put on, and I think that person's driving motivation is curiosity and desire to create something new and interesting.
Yeah.
And that pulls me forward. And I don't allow the imposter syndrome feeling to hold me back, because it really doesn't exist when I get into my flow of being a scientist. And that's why I have all these different side projects at work, a couple of which have taken off and become real projects. So yeah, I really like that answer of primitive accumulation.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, you know, I'm sure people will really want to listen to you, because I've been fascinated listening to you talk about genetic engineering and how that works.
Oh, thank you. I'll probably do a couple of YouTube videos or maybe podcasts even on my own where I just ramble on and on about genetic engineering, because I got a lot to say about it.
Yeah, I'd love to learn about it. I'm sure other people will.
One other thing I want to pick up from the emails that we exchanged was, playing the cards you've been dealt with as well as you can, rather than lamenting the fact that you didn't get a royal flush in intelligence. And then picking people that you admire that are hyper competent or intelligent and trying to copy their success and how they made themselves successful. I really like Charles Darwin. If you read his biography, he was sort of a lazy layabout who wasn't very intellectually impressive, but because he was extremely curious and took detailed notes, and he went on the voyage of the Beagle, he's the most famous biologist of all time because he put together this theory of evolution by natural selection. And then the fact that science, you know, moves forward by the 10,000 unsung heroes that push the field rather than the one super genius. And the last thing is the Scott Adams idea. You know, again, I take his his sort of observations separate from him as a person and his opinions, but the idea that you want to become number one in the world at something. And that number one is something that can only happen with the intersection of a few different skill sets. Nobody is going to be a better James Simpkins than you are. Like, you are entirely unique, and that'll never be replicated. So for him, he combined average drawing skills with a lifetime of experience working in offices and a little bit of funny writing. And he's a trained hypnotist and knows a little bit about sort of that like neuro-linguistic programming stuff. And he, talked to himself in the mirror every day for many years and said, I'm going to become a world famous cartoonist. And so he did. He made a lot of money. So in my mind, I'm not going to be the best in the world at synthetic biology. There's a lot of people who are much smarter or much more competent than I am. What I can do is try to put myself in the top 10% or 5% or 1% of people who study synthetic biology, and then combine that with maybe a background in neuroscience, be better than average in a certain field, and then be like a decent entrepreneur. And at that intersection, I think there might be a startup or potential business idea, as I've always wanted to start my own business, that, I'm not going to be number one in the world at neuroscience or entrepreneur or synthetic biology, but maybe in this tiny intersection, I might be the best person in the world for this particular thing. And I think you can do the same thing. I honestly believe that.
No, thanks.
You're getting good at content creation. You have a crazy cool background, PhD, and the US, UK relationships related to this. It sounds like there's a lot of game theory involved. I would be very interested to read some of your papers.
Yeah. Well, there is game theory involved, but my theory, or the theory that I use, the strategic relational approach, looks much more at ideas and actually tries to critique that rationalism and say it's much more about emotions and this emotional connection between the US and the UK, the special relationship. If you've ever heard of that, it's a big thing that gets bandied around in the UK, but it probably doesn't get heard a lot in the US. But it shapes British defence policy a lot, and it's not just a rational game theoretic calculation. I mean, it is to a certain degree, but it's based a lot on history and World War II, etc., World War One, different wars that the UK and US have been involved in, shared culture, etc.
Right. Okay. Cool. What was the thing we were talking? Oh, the cognitive dissonance thing. Can I hear your answer about the two ideas that you hold most highly in your head that are cognitive dissonant, and then I'll try to answer mine.
Well, I've got several, but one that I was thinking of recently is this conflict between capitalism and socialism. Well, I see myself as a lefty guy, but something that often strikes my mind, and through as we're communicating right now, there are a lot of sort of leftist Patreon people, Twitter people, YouTubers, and great, all power to them, but they are doing it through capitalist created technologies. And I know there's a lot in sort of leftist thought about how we can use privately created technologies to enrich everyone, let's say, and that's great. But that is something which is in my mind a lot, this conflict between capitalism and socialism, as in productivity, because I sometimes I just think in terms of films, our favorite great films, would they get produced if there wasn't a profit motive behind them?
It's a good question. Can you use the tools of the master to dismantle the master's house?
Yeah.
I don't know. I think at some point, I'm also interested in capitalism and socialism, and if there's a way to unite the two in sort of like we have, like a very pure form of ultra capitalism in the places where it's the most ethical and beneficial, and then like a very, socialism in its purest, most effective form in the places where it's needed. Like, I think the fact that the health industry is for profit in this country is pretty disgusting. But then again, the US produces more new medications than, almost anywhere else in the world, combined a lot of times. And again, that has been affected by what we're calling EROM's law, which is the flip of Moore's law, because it's taking $1.5 billion to push it to market in 10 years. And that's because the FDA regulations are so crazy. And so do we need to deregulate more? Do we need to regulate? I don't know. These are complicated questions.
So, yeah, I mean, this is the cognitive dissonance thing. I don't think these questions get resolved in our heads. It's just they create these fascinating internal thoughts and monologues that we're constantly having this discussion with ourselves.
Yeah, I would say the cognitive, one of the two things I'm probably the most cognitively dissonant about is I'm really, really excited about genetic engineering and synthetic biology. And I'm hoping that in our lifetimes, we'll see big advancements in, energy. I think nuclear power is going to play a much bigger role, and I would like to see us have an abundance of very cheap energy. Travel, I think it'll become hopefully much, much easier to travel across the planet very quickly, with maybe like maglev trains or, something other than planes. And hopefully we'll get to the moon and Mars very quickly and start setting up colonies there, because I do think we should be multiplanetary. I think the internet is going to change into something we can't even recognize. But I'm also very nervous about the applications of these technologies, because, with every great power, there is a, with the benefit of nuclear energy also comes the specter of nuclear weapons. I'm extremely worried about what that's going to look like for genetic engineering. As we start becoming more and more able to cure ourselves of all these horrible diseases and really improve our health, that also potentially comes with a lot of abuse. And I think I'm hoping that in our lifetimes we're going to see something like a golden age of technology and art and culture, and really just get out of this. I feel like we've been in a massive funk for like longer than my lifetime, 70 years maybe. I don't really have any like super hard evidence on that. It's just the intuition that things are not going as well as they could have. And I'm really pessimistic about how incapable and corrupt a lot of large institutions are. Like, the financial institution, all the banking and whatnot, our governmental institutions, our science is becoming corrupt, not to mention some of the even darker stuff like Jeffrey Epstein and whatnot. And so the answer is like, is that something you can solve by voting? Is that something you can solve by somehow making people more compassionate? I don't think we should persecute people that are psychopaths or people that have a brain problem and their facial recognition software is messed up and they see kids as sexual entities rather than adults. I think if you act on it, that you should go to jail forever. But how do you bring into the fold the people who end up rising to the top of power and end up abusing that power? I want them divorced from the power, but I don't want them, I don't want to see them like tortured and abused. I just think that there needs to be a better job of screening people for particular spots. How do you undo the giant system that we seem to be stuck in? Like, we're all products of this sort of hyper capitalist, multinational, corporate, matrix. system, whatever you want to call it. And as much as I would like to say, you know, peace and love is going to save the world, you know, maybe I just need more faith, but I think we need a better answer than that.
Mm-hmm. And on that tiny little question, I don't know if you feel that's a good place to wrap up.
I think that's a good stopping point. I definitely, I'll send you an invite to when we do my podcast next, maybe sometime next week. And I'm quite free these days when I'm not, you know, working. And I had a lot of fun. James, I appreciate you inviting me on.
Yeah, no, I enjoyed talking to you as well, Nick. It was really good. Appreciate you coming on, giving up your time. I will just stop the recordings now, and I'll send you those, the video, and do you want the audio as well? You might as well have them both.
Yeah, the audio too. Just let me know when you release it, and